7 days. Arthur sat with his back against the cold stone of his shelter and listened to the rain hammer the canopy in long grey sheets, dripping through the gaps in the ferns outside his door in fat, rhythmic drops. The sound was almost peaceful. Almost. 7 days ago he had crawled off a ledge 1/2 kilometre from a cave full of green eyes, his feet packed with bitter fungus and his chest full of cracked bone, and he had watched 6 hunting fires crawl toward him through the dark while a man called his name into the jungle. He had not answered. He had gone the other way, low and silent, the way system had taught him. The wolf-tooth hunters had swept the ridge for 2 nights and found a man who no longer left tracks. Then they had gone home, and Arthur had begun, very slowly, to build. He flexed his left arm. No pain, no weakness. Smooth, unbroken skin ran where a week ago the dire wolf's fangs had torn through to the tendon. The shelter had kept him alive, barely. It was a deeper cave than the first, set into the back of a stone amphitheatre near running water, and over 7 days he had made it his. A spike trap guarded the entrance, a pit of fire-hardened stakes under a lattice of woven fronds. It had taken a raptor on the 3rd night, and, on the 5th, something larger he had never been able to identify from what was left of it. He had stacked a wall of sharpened stakes across the mouth, hung a crude door of interlocked branches, and lined the floor with dried moss against the cold. It was not much, but it was his, and his was a word he had not owned in a long time. Every night that week he had lain on the stone while system fed him knowledge directly through the link, the way water finds the cracks in a thing and fills them. How to read the wind so it carried his scent away from prey. How to track. How to tell the leaf that healed from the leaf that stopped a heart. The spike trap had cost him 2 days, digging the pit with a flat stone and his bleeding hands, while the rain turned the spoil to soup that slid back in as fast as he hauled it out. He had fire-hardened each stake in the coals, one at a time, turning them, watching the wood darken without charring, until the points were harder than the bone of his fang. The 3rd night, a raptor had come for the smell of his cooking and dropped into the pit with a shriek that still woke him, and he had crouched at the lip with a rock in both hands and finished it, because system told him a wounded raptor was more dangerous than a whole one. And afterward he had been sick against the wall, quietly, so the jungle would not hear. He had not been sick the 5th night, when the pit took something larger, something he never saw whole and could not name from the pieces. He noticed that about himself. He noticed that it was getting easier, and he was not certain whether that was the jungle making him stronger or simply hollowing him out. He had learned to measure the days by his body, the way he had once measured them by a clock. The slow knitting of the wolf bite, the fading of the bruises from yellow to nothing, small machines repairing themselves, the system's blue numbers tracking the repair, and Arthur watching them climb, the way a starving man watches a pot. None of it prepared him for the chime. It sounded inside his skull, soft and insistent, and his stomach dropped before the words even resolved. Alert! Multiple human thermal signatures. 8. 800 meters south-southeast. Approaching. He was on his feet before he had decided to stand, moving to the entrance with the silence system had drilled into him until it lived in his joints. He pressed himself into the shadow of the outer wall, the rain soaking through his makeshift pelt, and the system laid a thermal overlay across the green, painting the jungle in smears of orange heat against the cool blue of the wet trees. 8 figures, moving in formation. Spears, stone axes, The wedge a hunting party makes when it expects to kill something. His throat closed. Wolf tooth. The interface ringed the lead figure in pulsing gold, and Arthur did not need the highlight to know that frame, that distinctive hitch in the stride, that way of carrying himself like a man who had survived decades in a world built to kill him and had stopped being impressed by it. Boron, the veteran, the one who had argued loudest for the separation, who had spat in Arthur's face at the ceremony and named him less than prey while the spit was still warm on his cheek. He counted weapons out of old habit. 5 spears, 2 stone axes, and 1 hunter with something long and curved slung across his back that was not a weapon at all. A horn. A signal horn. You did not carry a signal horn unless you expected to need to call for help, or to call others to a kill too big for the men present. They were not passing through. They were hunting something specific. Arthur's pulse beat in his ears. He pressed deeper into the shadow, breath coming in shallow, governed sips. The rain was washing his scent into the ground. The canopy ate the light. He was as close to invisible as a living thing could be here, unless they already knew where to look. 60 meters out, Boron raised a closed fist, and the wedge froze as one animal. Arthur's blood turned to meltwater. They were close, far too close. If they found the cave, the traps, the smoke stain on the rock, they would find him, and he would be opened up and left for the jungle before he managed 3 steps. Boron crouched. His scarred hand traced a shape in the churned mud. Tracks. Arthur went rigid. His own tracks, surely, from a careless water run. The veteran rose and his gaze swept the tree line, searching, weighing, and then his eyes fell on the dark slot of the cave entrance and stopped. Arthur did not move, did not breathe. The rain fell, the jungle held. 1 heartbeat, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then Boron turned away, barked a low command, and the party shifted east along the ridge. Arthur let the breath out of his body in a long, silent shudder. His knees went loose with relief, hot and dizzying. The relief lasted exactly 2 seconds, because Boron had not been looking at the cave. He had been looking past it, at the print in the mud beside the entrance. Arthur saw it now, and could not understand how he had walked past it a dozen times without seeing it, except that the mind refuses some things until it is forced. A single footprint, deep and wide, 3 splayed toes ending in claw gouges like buried daggers. It was 3 times the length of his own foot. It belonged to nothing that should be able to move quietly, and yet it had pressed itself into the earth a body's length from where he had slept, and he had heard nothing. The hunters were not tracking Arthur. They were tracking whatever had made that print, and they were following it home. "What is that?" he breathed, the words barely a shape on his lips. Print characteristics consistent with a large predatory theropod. Length estimate 8 to 10 meters. Mass estimate 3 to 4 metric tons. 3 to 4 tons, Arthur repeated, and the words came out tasting of ash. That's a dinosaur. East, the party followed the trail away from him, and Boron's voice carried back through the rain in fragments of the harsh wolf-toothed tongue. Big kill, tried feast, honor hunt. They were not merely tracking the beast, they meant to bring it down. Arthur crouched over the print, and a cold certainty crawled up his spine. The toes pointed one way. The push-off ridge at the back, where the beast had shoved its weight forward, pointed the other. Direction confirmed. The blue arrow bloomed over the print, pointing northwest. away from the cave. The beast had walked past, not toward, days ago, on its way out of the territory. For a moment his shoulders dropped. Then the rest of the logic arrived and pulled them tight again. The hunters were tracking it east, following the trail backward toward its source, toward where it had come from. Northwest, where his cave was. "It's coming back," he whispered. "They're going to find where it started and they're going to chase it right back here." Probability of the theropod returning to this location, 87%. Large theropods establish hunting territories and return to favored sites. This cave lies inside the boundary it has marked. He backed into the shelter, hands not quite steady. He needed to think. He looked at what he had. Stone tools, sharpened stakes, the wolf's fang lashed to a straight hardwood shaft to make a crude spear. None of it would do more than annoy a creature that could knock down trees by leaning on them. System. Options. Option 1. Immediate evacuation. Abandon the shelter, seek new ground. Survival probability 34%. Too low. Next. Option 2. Fortify the entrance with secondary barriers. Survival probability 52%. A coin flip, weighted slightly toward living. Better. Next. Option 3. Allow the hunting party to engage the predator. Use the engagement as cover to evacuate or to prepare a killing ground. Survival probability 68%, the highest number on the board. And it meant standing in the dark and listening to 8 men die so that he could slip away clean. He despised the wolf tooth. He had carried their verdict carved into his own face for 7 days. And the thought of using them as bait still turned something over in his gut. Anything that doesn't end with me letting people get eaten. Option 4. Make contact with the hunting party. Warn them of the predator's return. Propose a temporary alliance. Survival probability 41%. Arthur laughed, short and bitter. They'd opened my throat before I finished the first word. Analysis concurs. Wolftooth protocol regarding exiles is consistent and unforgiving. Contact would most likely end in your immediate execution. A roar rolled through the jungle, deep and resonant and old, and the rain seemed to flatten under the weight of it. It went through Arthur's chest and rattled his teeth in their sockets. Far to the east, through the thermal overlay, he saw the hunting party freeze, saw Boron's fist go up again, calling for absolute stillness. The roar came again, closer. Arthur's mind, the engineer's mind, had stopped panicking somewhere in the last few seconds and started working. A 4-ton animal was not a wall to be pushed against. It was a load, and every load, no matter how vast, moved its weight through points, joints, balance, momentum. And points could be attacked by a man too weak to attack anything else. System, I need a weapon. Something that can actually hurt that thing. Not strength, I don't have any. Chemistry, physics, anything. Analyzing available resources. The local flora includes several species with potent toxins. With correct extraction, a crude neurotoxin is possible. It would not need to penetrate deeply. It would need only to enter the bloodstream. Arthur's eyes went wide. You can make poison! We can. There is a fungus, purple-capped, growing along the wet seams of the rock, and a red berry on the vines near the water. Crushed, boiled, and reduced, the two together affect the nervous system. Filtered through moss, The result is concentrated enough to matter. Another roar, nearer. To the east, the hunters had dropped into a defensive ring, spears outward, eyes raking the canopy. Arthur watched them and saw, in the stiffness of their shoulders and the way they kept glancing to Boron for direction, men who had hunted mammoths and wolves their whole lives and had never once faced anything like what was coming. They were not ready. They only thought they were. "Time!" Arthur said, already moving, gathering the sharpest blades, the hollowed gourds, the wolf-fang spear. 45 minutes for extraction and reduction. Effectiveness will depend on dose delivered and the creature's mass. A scratch may be enough. A scratch may be nothing. The margin is real. And if it gets here before 45 minutes, then we implement option 3, and I will not apologize for it. The rain intensified, drumming the canopy like 1,000 fists, and Arthur worked inside the noise with frantic, deliberate care. Crush the purple cats to a paste. Boil the red berries until the water ran dark. Reduce. Filter the liquid through a wad of clean moss into a gourd. Drop by patient drop while the world outside came apart. The purple caps came apart wetly under the stone, releasing a smell like rot and almonds that made his eyes water and his head go light. And system warned him, flat and immediate, to breathe through his mouth and to keep his cut hands clear of the paste. Because what would merely sicken a 4-ton animal would stop a heart his size in minutes. He boiled the dark liquid over a fire built small and tight against the rock so the light would not carry, and he watched it cook down from a gourd full to a finger's depth. Every minute of evaporation a minute he did not have, his ears straining past the rain for the next roar. His fingers shook. He steadied them by force, because system had been very clear that the difference between a dose that worked and a dose that did nothing lived in the last reduction, in the patience to let the water leave and the poison stay. His heart pounded, his fingers shook, but behind his eyes the engineer stayed cold and clear, and that, he understood now, was the only weapon he had ever truly owned. Another roar, so close that grit sifted from the cave ceiling, and the puddles on the floor shivered into rings. Arthur dipped the wolf-fang spear into the dark liquid in the gourd, and watched the neurotoxin sheet across the bone, filling the jagged grooves of the fang. One scratch, that was the whole plan. One scratch, and a thing the size of a house would slow and stagger and fall. If the poison worked, if the dose was enough, if his hand was steady, if he lived long enough to use it. The ground shook. To the east, the hunter's ring broke as a shape moved through the trees toward them, shouldering ancient trunks aside as though they were reeds, and the canopy thrashed in a line that pointed with terrible clarity back along the trail. Back toward the cave. Back toward him. Arthur stepped into the mouth of his shelter, the poisoned spear raised, the rain running down the bone tip and dripping black off the point. His breath caught in his throat. The hunt had found its way home.